Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 28 of my game system design video series. This video is an attempt to analyze visibility and observation rules and determine some basic guidelines in their creation for use in micro armor figure gaming rules. This is my sixth update of this video, which includes corrected and updated content and improved images. If you've viewed this before, the changes are comparatively minor. This video is an attempt to determine the optimum observation or visibility rules to use in micro armor figure gaming rules. This will be of general use to those considering designing their own rules, but others may find it useful in understanding why different rules uses different types of visibility or observation rules, or for new players, so they can now understand what visibility or observation rules are supposed to represent. On the surface, observation and visibility are simple concepts which should be a trivial matter to deal with. But when we're dealing with different terrain types and firing from the edge of terrain or being within terrain, the rules can get surprisingly complex. This is even the case where there is an active effort that has been made to simplify the rules. Some cases which need to always be considered are terrain effects, edge of terrain or within terrain effects, target moving, target firing. These factors, such as what to do when elements move or conduct fire combat, can also increase complexity because this may very well affect visibility and observation, particularly being observed. These activities normally allow an element to be seen from a greater distance, which can raise a number of record-keeping issues, and exactly when does the action increase the distance these elements can be seen needs to be defined. At its simplest level, visibility ranges are based on the size of the element. A large element is easy to see, while a smaller one is more difficult. The simplest breakdown is a vehicle, artillery and infantry. Some vehicles may be unusually small, thus fall into the artillery class, and some artillery are unusually large, so fall in the vehicle class. Some artillery, such as anti-tank guns, are purposely small, so may fall into the infantry class. Finally, all these classifications can be affected when the element has taken cover, is moving, or is conducting fire combat. A simple method to deal with firing, moving, or taking cover is to create two dummy visibility levels above the three that we've defined and two below. If moving, then shift up by 1, that is, becomes more visible. If firing, shift up by 2, becomes even more visible. If taking cover, shift down 1, becoming less visible. If we add a simple terrain class, cluttered terrain, or terrain which offers cover, we can shift down 1 if the element is in such terrain, and shift down 2 if it's also taking cover in this terrain. There is some minor complexity in how you deal with more than one of these cases occurring together, but if you think out or design it in a simple manner or building block manner at the beginning, it can be dealt with in a comparatively simple manner. Other methods you could use is to create a visibility class of firing or moving or taking cover. We end up with a possible issue with this, as do you differentiate infantry taking cover from vehicles taking cover? A lot depends on how complex you wish to go, but these are some of the considerations when creating observation rules. In squad scale rules, or even skirmish, designers may opt for random observation. Based on the range and some modifiers, which we've partially already discussed, the player has to spin a dice to determine if they're seen or not. The advantage of this system is the designer does not have to be so careful about ranges, but the downside is more dice rolling, which adds complexity and slows down play. I generally do not like random visibility rules, but it does mean you do not need to be careful what ranges you list. When visibility ranges are fixed and automatic, all sorts of unusual tactics can develop if you make an error with the ranges, so ranges need to be carefully considered. The temptation is great to create a large list of terrain features with unique visibility effects, and this overwhelming temptation should be avoided at all costs. There are, or should only be, 3 basic types of terrain that a designer should be considering. Terrain which provides cover even if troops are not taking advantage of it, terrain which offers cover if troops are taking advantage of it, and terrain which never offers cover. Effects can vary based on the troop type, thus infantry can take advantage of, let's say, brush, but tanks obviously can't because they're too large. This does raise an important point about terrain. Most designers start with the terrain and then list the effects. This is viable but results in a plethora of terrain types and their effects, which does add complexity. Designers can reduce the terrain types covered, which is the normal path taken to simplify terrain rules and basically build building blocks. The optimal method is to list the effect of terrain and then let players to place terrain effects down on the playing area rather than the actual terrain. Players can decide what the terrain actually is, but from a rules point of view, this is unnecessary. You're only interested in the effect. So, as an example, a player places terrain which offers automatic cover to infantry class elements and standard cover for the rest. Players can decide this is a cornfield or low brush, but the designer should only consider what the effect is. Using this system, every possible type of terrain can be represented, but the rules remain very simple. There is one final class of terrain, which is terrain which blocks visibility or blocks a line of sight. When considering blocking lines of sight, we need to break terrain down into three classes. Open terrain, which does not block a line of sight up to its observation range. Cluttered terrain, which blocks a line of sight if traced a certain distance through it or greater through it. Opaque terrain, which always blocks a line of sight. To cover what happens when troops are on the edge of terrain, you can assume that they can observe outward unimpeded, but can take advantage of any terrain that they're physically in. Clear terrain never blocks a line of sight. However, the line of sight can be finite. This is what we've already been generally discussing with observation up until this point. Opaque terrain is rather easy to define and would basically be a hill or a solid object. In summary, it's opaque and always blocks the line of sight. Cluttered terrain, or possibly translucent terrain, is terrain which is not opaque, but which distorts visibility, and if enough of it exists, it can block a line of sight. This type of terrain would use the standard terrain rules, so can automatically offer cover or can provide cover if elements are taking advantage of it. However, a line of sight can only extend a finite distance before being blocked within it. Assuming what I call cluttered terrain blocks a line of sight beyond 3 centimetres. Using a simple rule like this, an element can reside on the edge of cluttered terrain and see out unimpeded. If it's on the edge but within 3 centimetres, then anything it's observing takes advantage of the terrain. If further than 3 centimetres from the edge, it cannot be seen from outside and cannot see outside. At any time when an element is in the terrain, it takes advantage of the terrain. This is a simple set of rules which cover all the combination possible within this type of terrain. Other systems are also possible, but this I feel is the simplest and most complete system I'm aware of. If our rules take into account elements taking cover as distinct from being in the open, then elements can attempt to take cover in the following terrain. Clear terrain would contain trees, brushes, minor hills, which could be taken advantage of. In cluttered terrain, there is more opportunity of taking cover. Finally, in deserts, plains or steppe, there is no opportunity of taking cover. Designers could get more complex if they wish. This just describes the simplest possible system which caters for most cases. While it's possible to ignore lighting conditions, when you get to platoon scale or higher, it needs to be considered. The temptation is to create more up and down modifiers, but these conditions are rare, and a better system would be to somehow separate these effects. One possible method is to create new observation range columns, one for each lighting effect. Thus, if it's dawn or dusk, players use the dawn or dusk column. The rules effect are negligible. You only need to expand the observation table. Smoke is a special condition which could also fit into this column solution. Thus, avoiding special smoke modifiers, which you almost never need to use, and thus do not want to see each time you check visibility ranges, can be accommodated by simply creating this column. This is an example visibility table. If 6 mil figures, they represent centimetres. If 15 mil, they represent inches. Using a table of this nature, we could take into account weather, such as rain, snow, blizzard and storm, by the use of right shifts. There is another benefit of the system when you move to modern conflicts. The use of infrared, image intensification and thermal imaging can be modelled by left shifts on this table. Once again, we avoid the use of special modifiers which are only used rarely. As most conflicts occur in daylight, most players would quickly memorise the common value, speeding up play dramatically, while the rules would still be able to cater for all other possible observation conditions, particularly lighting conditions. The final point is always consider the KISS principle. The example provided is the simplest possible observation system I'm aware of, which can take into account every typical visibility scenario. You need to ensure that you need this level of detail. When we're looking at a set of rules where a battalion is an element, this level of detail is overkill. At squad scale, when an element represents a vehicle, this level of detail is almost mandatory, with platoon and company scale sitting somewhere in between. And so we come to an end of episode 28 of my presentation on micro armor game system design, in this case covering observation and visibility. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.